Hi, welcome to Peak Moment. I'm Janaea Donaldson, and my guests today are Celine Rich, who's the Executive Director, and Julian Darley, who's the Director of Post-Carbon Institute. And one day we're going to say these two folks were the founders of a movement that spread across the world. But we're at the beginning stages. Take us back to the earliest roots of how you got into post-carbon. What were you doing way back when that led you to this?
We started in 2000 after we finished our education, looking for something to do in a way of responding to the things that were happening in the world that we could see that weren't being covered, and that climate change was getting worse, and we were looking for something to respond to that. And we set up a nonprofit organization called Meta Foundation, and from there our first project was Global Public Media, which we started, which rolled out at the end of 2001.
And what did you do with Global Public Media? What were you intending to do? What did it function as?
Global Public Media is now, its tagline is now public service broadcasting for a post-carbon world. But when it first started, it was a reaction to the problems of, particularly of broadcast media in North America, and also I'd done some research in the BBC, which is quite a good public, I think in many ways an excellent public service broadcasting system. But nonetheless, it's not perfect. You couldn't expect that, and they have a lot of trouble dealing with scientific issues. And I'd done some research particularly on the way current affairs programs, which have the highest sort of serious political audiences, deal with that, and they have some profound problems with that. And I wanted to address some of those difficulties with the way the BBC was dealing with scientific and other complex issues. It wasn't just scientific, but complex issues, and the much more profound difficulties that virtually all American media and North American media have with well, not just complex scientific issues, but difficult issues. And so we wanted to produce something that would allow people to see archived in perpetuity and for no fee access to the highest quality long-form interviews, in which there would be virtually no editing other than to take out just unfortunate glitches and to ask questions which were informed by the work of the interviewee. And part of the idea was we were trying to, and we still try to ask the interviewee the kinds of questions they'd really like to be asked, so they can basically frame the issues as they would wish to frame them, which sometimes takes a while, and also to talk to an audience that was essentially like them, so they wouldn't have to oversimplify things. If they felt like simplifying things, that's fine.
Service to all of us.
And it's still available. Every interview we've ever done over the last 5 years, us and all those who are involved with Global Public Media, is still available. And that was one of the things that's troubling to me with a public service broadcast station like the BBC or the CBC, is much of their material is not available to the public, even though we as taxpayers or licence payers in the case of the BBC have paid for it.
And the issues, you know, don't stop in 2 years, in 5 years, particularly complex issues.
Yeah. And how do you go back and do research? I mean,
of course.
We're doing interviews with world experts on the subjects.
What kinds of subjects? Give us a flavor, just a flavor, and then how.
Well, we started with the idea of just general biosphere destruction, if you like.
Just biosphere.
Yeah, just merely that.
Simple topics.
Yes. Yeah. So basically, all the unfortunate and wretched things we were doing to ourselves and to the planet, and then as the awareness of peak oil grew, or more or less exploded in our case. We have undoubtedly focused on energy issues and peak oil, but that doesn't mean we're not still interested in the unfortunate biosphere issues, including climate change, which have notably not gone away, but are all strongly interconnected with the energy and with each other. So that's the kind of the broad swathe of issues, and anything that's connected with those, which encompasses just about everything except, you know, what the basketball scores are.
And then we started doing conferences, because we thought it was really important to take the issues of the energy issues that we were learning about out there to people to discuss them. And we did 12 conferences in 5 different countries. And after we had Richard Heinberg and Kenneth DeFays and Julian talking about all these issues, question time was a bit, people were a bit taken aback, and the questions were, what do we do now? what can I do about this?
So let's go back to those speakers for a minute, because our audience may not know. Richard Heinberg, of course, reaching us about peak oil and the need to power down. Kenneth DeFace, tell us who he is.
He is a Princeton emeritus petroleum geologist. He's recently, he wrote a book called Hubbert's Peak about 5 years ago.
Hubbert's Peak, which is
Hubbert's
the curve
Peak.
we all know as the classic oil decline peak
Yes,
curve.
yeah, oil and by and large
And
gas too,
yes,
yep.
right.
Yep. So that's Ken DeFace.
Right.
We interviewed Colin Campbell, who is in many ways the doyen of the petroleum geologists who've been speaking out about this in the last 10 to 15 years. Matt Simmons, I mean, essentially...
The investment banker
yes,
who
yeah.
really is laid bare in twilight in the desert, whether Saudi Arabia may indeed be at peak. We just don't know, but looking possible.
Yes, definitely looking possible.
So you were really beginning to glean all of the top
yes.
minds
Yes.
in the area of energy decline.
Yes, pretty much anybody who was anybody and that we could get to, we would interview, and still do.
But people got to asking, what do we do about this? Because
Yes.
you hit the stark reality and you hit a wall.
Immediately we
right?
found people quite sensibly starting to wonder what to do.
Yes.
And that's where our interest and our excitement took off, because it's the what can you do part that motivated us in the beginning to do all of this. And we have a little tagline which we've developed recently, and it's called Reduce, Produce, 90% less, and make the rest. And
Wait a minute, let's do this. Reduce, produce.
Yep.
90% less.
Yeah.
And make the rest.
And make the rest. Make the 10%?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, explain that. Talk about it.
Well, reduce your demand, reduce your consumption, reduce your energy use, which will reduce the outputs and the pollutions and all the negative aspects around that. And then you still have, one needs to still live, produce that, but produce it locally. So by reducing how far you get things from, that reduces the amount of energy and inputs that it takes. If you source your stuff locally, whether it's locally grown food or locally made clothing and furniture, then there's local things that go into that. So again, there's less things that go into it. If they last longer, there's less waste. So how can we live more locally is what the sort of equal signs
That's
is
the
there.
10% side in this thing.
Yeah, that's the production, if you like, the substitution of the more unfortunate parts of our production system. What one needs to think about is a provisioning system, a supply chain system. And if you think about most of what's surrounding us in this room and in life, most of it has come large distances with the expenditure of large amounts of energy, often made by people in very unfortunate circumstances, doing very unfortunate things to the surrounding ecosystems. If you can still do bad things to your local ecosystem. Sure, you can chop down the forests all around you, and we know how to do that.
And we've done all that really well all over the world.
We know how to do that. But at least if you're producing things locally, with as best you can with locally sourced materials, local knowledge, it has to be often done with quite a lot of skill, but we're not incapable of rebuilding and regarnering local skills and so forth. Then you start to rebuild the ability to be self-reliant, the ability to close the supply chain loops so that you're no longer reliant on multi-thousand...
So you're talking about the very opposite, the mirror opposite of globalization.
Yeah, it's absolute.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, localization is just that other side.
Yeah.
And so when I first got that notion from you, I found myself thinking about, okay, who in our area do we have the metallic, for example, metallurgy, the ability to do, okay, I'm in an area where we make gold came out of the ground. Do we want to continue a gold mine? Noxious,
Not
toxic. Really. No, I mean, but thinking about who will make doorknobs or door handles. I mean, just simple things like that. When one thinks about the two levels of what are those 10%, those essentials, those essential things, really, and which of those things could we not be able to provision locally? I'll give you a real simple example. Some of us ate locally 1 week last summer, and I defined locally as within 50 miles. And the first thing that I missed was salt. And I immediately understood why people traded for salt for thousands of years. Salt. We don't have salt there. So that's only one simple example. So when I think of your 10% example, I'm thinking we have bigger needs than that.
Yep.
And so I'm saying, how realistic is it to think of 10% of what we now consume?
Well, it's In a sense, now it seems pretty tough, but it's going to seem much more realistic as we go into energy decline. But that's one of the reasons why we've developed the policy called global relocalization. And the relocalization part means shortening those supply chains, as I say, to get away from the multi-thousand-mile supply chains of virtually everything and to bring it into the locale as best you can. Sometimes that locale may be a few hundred yards, and sometimes it may still be quite a long distance. You've mentioned salt. There are many other things. It's going to be quite tough. So the global part has a number of reasons why we coined global relocalization. Is we are still going to need to keep trading for things.
Yes.
This is quite clear.
Yes.
Whether it was a wise idea to start down this path is another matter. But here we are. Here we are, unfortunately, and we try to be very practical about this. There are many things which we think we've managed to construct which are not good ideas. But if you're going to be practical and honest about getting people over the carbon chasm to somewhere else, which is going to be frankly, a much lower energy society in the sort of the external sense of it. Doesn't mean we can't be exuberant, but it means we're going to be exuberant with a lot less of external energy
that we're burning to do that.
So if you're going to do that, then you have got to, say for better or for worse, you have got to still think about trading, just because unfortunately, look at us, we have no nice thick fur. That means places which are cold, we're either going to have to abandon, or we're going to have to bring the firewood or the biogas or whatever it is in to keep ourselves warm and so forth. Now, the question is, should we be in those cold places? Should we be in the places that have no rain, where you can't grow any food? And the list is, unfortunately, rather long. However, in order to transition so that we can make those rather awkward judgments and decisions, we will still need to keep going on doing certain things which probably are dysfunctional, but we're honest about that. And so that's where the global part comes in one sense. We're going to keep needing to exchange, and that will undoubtedly still include trade. Another aspect of the global part is that if you don't persuade quite a lot of your near neighbours to do something relatively similar, and they see that you've managed to grow some food in some hard times, and they have bigger muscles, or unfortunately bigger
guns,
and they're unfortunately bigger military than you, then you're not going to have your little pile of bounty for very long. So there is a very real sense in which we start to address this tricky other aspect of security, is that if we don't persuade other people of this idea, then it's going to get into a lot of trouble.
So what you're talking about is opportunity and challenge, or the crisis of both. Either we all learn some way to cooperate, work together,
or at least enough of
build
us.
community.
I don't know that we humans can, to be honest, all can go. May not be politically
especially in
correct.
this position of overshoot that the world's in at the moment.
That's the other number thing I was going to think of. You know, your question of, do we really belong in the tropics and the desert and places that are marginal, or with global warming, rising coastline, rising sea levels and so on, coastlines that get flooded. It's like, where do people go, since we have created a situation where we have so many more billions of people on the planet than the solar yearly cycle would have ever permitted. So we've borrowed from the future and, in a sense, raised our population rates from the future in a compact time.
And borrowed from the past, of course.
Of course,
We've
all
borrowed
built
from,
on the past.
We've borrowed from the captured sunlight of oil, gas and coal in particular.
So what do you do with these masses of people? I mean, I'm talking about reducing the consumption, but there's still the footprint of everybody needing things.
That's why it's 90% and 10%. That kind of goes along with the carbon dioxide and the need to reduce the amount of greenhouse gases.
Many climate scientists claim we need to reduce energy demand by 90%.
We're following the data. Really.
Yeah, follow the data is one of our other mantras.
But
excellent.
With the population, one of the things that we're saying is that if every woman has only one child or 0 children, we're going to go into a gradual decline of population, which is the only humane way of reducing overall global population without wars and major diseases or starvation or all those other unfortunate things. I mean, we may still have the disease. Humans, because there's so many of us, that's been part of our history. But if we want to have a decline in population, which we need to meet the amount of energy and let the earth recuperate some of its natural spaces, then we need to make that choice of having less children every woman in the world.
So
And
I'm
their
thinking there's
choices being supported.
two highly unpopular ideas that that are at least
Yes,
two.
no kidding.
Right. One is affluent.
We have more if you like.
Ideas, yeah.
Let's start with these two. We'll add to
Okay.
it. Affluent Westerners, Americans and Europeans. Oh, please reduce your material consumption, your energy consumption, and your physical stuff consumption 90%. That doesn't sound like that's going to fly too
You
well.
won't get many votes.
Out of
You're a politician on that. Very few businesses will be able to find that a selling notion.
And the other very unpopular one is have just one child.
Yeah, one or
When
none.
there's
No, or zero.
Or zero.
Yeah, maybe
Yeah.
one.
When you consider sort of the biological imperative and eons of our own biological history.
Yes, we spent 3.6 billion years as a DNA oriented creatures.
However, if we really
reproducing,
were
so-
DNA-oriented creatures, we would realize that our species is in peril, and the only way that we can prolong it is by having less children, so that those
That's
children
an irony,
have a better way of surviving.
And in a sense, we would be recapturing wisdom from cultures who really did know the carrying capacity of the land and their limits, who knew how to limit fertility.
They had to.
And or everybody would be
They
starving.
couldn't cheat with oil and gas. We started
We
cheating
cheated.
with...
Yes,
Well, we
of
were.
course.
Well, now we started cheating with burning wood. Once we discovered and mastered fire, and how to control it and then how to produce it, that's where we were really able to go wrong. Because once you're able to do that, you can burn down forests en masse to produce what is often rather poor quality soil, which is often then strip mined usually. But once you've got control of fire, we're really the creatures of fire. I mean, we are the ultimate Promethean creature. And rather than being a Stone Age, a stone creature, a Paleolith, we're more igneous, which is Latin for fire. So it's fire, and of course it's because we're naked. I mean, we're not naked now because we're covered.
Well, we're no longer on the savannah either.
Yeah, exactly.
We're
but we're covered with largely petroleum-made fibres, and before that it would have been something more sensible.
Wool or flax.
Yeah.
Or
Yeah,
something,
at least something that was more... Those things are more certainly renewable if they're done in reasonably sensible ways. So, I mean, this is what's got us into so much trouble. Once we were able to control fire, and later on came agriculture, but much later on, we were able to spread everywhere. And we burn wood, and then in Britain, for instance, we've been using coal for possibly at least 1,000 years, and possibly longer than that. Yep,
Really?
yep.
I didn't realize we were doing that.
Yeah, as
So
soon as we
long.
found coal, we realised it was good to burn, but it had nasty effects. It was known 800 or 900 years ago that it was nasty stuff, but my goodness, it's energy dense.
Yes. Yes.
It's energy
yes.
dense, and it
In
at
case
least...
little piece. And,
Yes, usually at least twice as energy dense as wood. So instead of having to hulk 100 pounds of wood, you carry 50 pounds of coal, and you get the same amount of heat out. Usually that's a minimum, because wood is usually moist unless you dry it. And the more moist wood is, generally the less heat you get out of it, for various reasons. So here you had the first, it's a carbon hydrocarbon. And that's one of the things that was then able to get us further into this mess. So it looks clever, but it always gets us deeper into the mire.
We outline this whole story in our forthcoming book, Relocalize Now, Getting Ready for Climate Change and the End of Cheap Oil.
And so what do you suggest people do? All right, relocalize now. What do you mean? What is that?
What we've been explaining, where you shorten your supply chains, where you think about moving from a fuel to a foot economy. We must go back to using our muscles.
And to start doing that, we're suggesting that we build parallel public infrastructures. So we know we live in this globalized structure now. What can we start building within our communities that has the skeleton or the template, so when the globalized structure starts to decrease, the local structure can start to increase? And there's going to be benefits to having more local economies and more locally produced things, whether it's more jobs or more community connections and more hopefully community culture.
More friends. I mean, more theatre.
Let's envision this sort of on the ground. Sort of what a parallel public infrastructure. I mean, that's a really interesting notion. So what? Give us some examples of what that might look like. That we're
local
used to.
money, local food, local energy, more local governance.
Okay, so let's go. Okay, local food. So we're looking at big cities or the rural areas that are marginal areas, because we're dealing with the population we now have, finding ways to be inventive with gardens and farms and or pasturing or whatever. I mean, closer to home, right?
Which means we're going to need to amend our diet as well, and eat much less energy-intensive foods, which would be
The animals.
flesh
Animals
foods
and fish.
and fish.
Of course,
Well,
because we're
they're-
fishing, we're losing our fish by
Yes.
overfishing
Yeah.
anyway.
And processed food. I mean, processed food is processed with
High
energy.
energy.
And of course,
and
delightful-
transported and refrigerated, so
Yes.
less,
So we're gonna-
less
Yeah,
refrigeration.
and chemicals, which are not only bad for us, but are also energy intense themselves.
That's true.
So we're going to need to eat a more plant-based diet, which is probably more whole grains or whatever, and that's made locally, and spending more time preparing them.
And growing
Oh,
them.
For certainly,
And
because if we're not going
growing
to be if we're not going to be getting processed food, we're going to be having to find ways to dry this food or
Yes.
or can this food, and prepare it and make it interesting and still
Yeah.
tasty and fun and all of that.
And the transition is going to be tricky because we've unfortunately lost, or more likely thrown away, this knowledge. We don't at the moment have time, or at least that is the perception. And these transitions are not going to be frightfully easy. The less so-called developed countries, the second world of Ukraine and Poland and Slovakia and places like that, the former Soviet bloc, and so-called third world countries may, and there's evidence now already rising, may have an easier time during this transition because they're less petroleum dominated and dependent.
And they haven't lost their traditional knowledge
That's
of,
the other thing.
in this example, the food
They
preparation.
can still grow. They still
know how to grow the food that grows well in their
Yeah.
area.
And make the things locally, whether it's your doorknobs or your shoes.
Yes,
These things
yes.
all require a great deal of skill and local knowledge.
And the tools to make them. You can think to
The
take
hand tools in particular.
take the
'cause
hand
you know,
tools, but think about where lathes are made. It's very hard to buy, as far as I know, a North American lathe. You have to buy them from Sweden or Germany.
That's what I started
Those are
to
the
realize, is
nearest.
that the main things that we are coming from China or other
Or
countries.
China for your virtually everything, including lathes.
So we've lost how to make those things.
The knowledge that has been lost by offshoring and deliberately exporting all those jobs and all that productive capacity is going to be extremely difficult to rebuild, as will the supply chains, the rebuilding of the supply chains to supply
And the
lot.
tools to actually make them with.
Yeah, it's we.
So that we used to could supply the tools and the materials locally.
Right.
And the machines to make the machines, or the,
I'm
even
thinking of the
simpler
fact that
hand
in my
tools.
lifetime we have watched the tool makers of automobiles, which of course will not be as functional in this time,
Yes, well,
are no longer here. I mean,
Still.
the big three are skeletons.
Yeah.
You know, they're hoax.
To some extent, tool makers are tool makers. If you have an ability to make tools, then you may be able to adapt to make other tools. If you've no clue how to make tools, to come back to the lathe, a wood or a metal lathe, if you're pretty good at them, with a lathe or a drill press and these very milling machines, you can make all kinds of different
Yes,
things.
yes.
Hammer or a screw or a nail, or maybe if a rolling plant, you can roll certain girders. I mean, this is all assuming this large population we've got. And you could certainly turn around and say, well, actually, should we even be thinking that way? Well, the trouble is, if you don't think that way, then what are we going to do with this large number of people? And we personally, anyway, refuse to just abandon, because it will include us. How are we to know that we're not going to be included in this abandonment, man?
Sure.
So one has to be honest and realistic about this. We're going to need all sorts of things which will just hopefully be less dysfunctional, and we get less dysfunctional as we go. But we cannot just, it's absurd to think that we just throw out what we've got. I mean, if there's a cataclysmic collapse, it will happen, but we are trying to avoid that.
Yes.
We're trying to help people contract, which means planning for contraction, contracting the economy, getting control over your money system, which includes some kind of local money system, changing the monetary system, which is
That's a
vast
big,
thing.
I mean,
That's
huge.
another thing that one can
It's
go in
huge.
parallel too.
Yeah,
Is the money system.
it's on the one hand, we've been trying to do relocalized money systems for 70 or 80 years. It's been a very tricky area. Not necessarily many people understand why. If you talk to people in the Depression era, they knew why we needed a localized money system.
Yes.
However, there is a lot of interest around this. There's a lot of interest about localized energy, relocalizing your
all
energy
the
production.
solar and wind and,
Yep.
and so on, which
and
is
we
helpful.
have a project we're working on at UBC in Vancouver, at the University of British Columbia, where we're doing a demonstration, integrated, reliable, renewable energy.
Called
So
an energy farm.
An energy farm. So we're
We're doing
actually
it now.
planting things
Excellent.
to
Yep.
see if we can grow, what kinds of energy you can make from plants. But also we've got solar and wind, and the idea is that it needs a constant flow of energy.
So you have it from different sources at different
Yes.
times of the year,
So-
or times of the day, or
time of the day,
whatever.
so you can balance to produce reliable. The problem that renewable energy faces is that the coal and nuclear chaps can always come along and say, well, in the middle of the night, or when when the wind
Sure,
is not
it's
blowing,
snowing, or-
yeah,
yes.
exactly. What are you going to do? Where is your energy?
That's right. That's
And
right.
where are your liquid fuels going to come from? Because wind doesn't produce much liquid fuel.
I was going to say, liquids are, I mean, we are really in a tough spot there,
Yes,
because nothing
yes.
can quite match the portability
Nothing can
and
anywhere
energy
near
that
match,
we
is
have
the
of
truth.
gasoline.
Yeah.
I mean,
So-
it's way out ahead.
So we're trying to
One
develop the idea of reliable renewable energy, which will deliver energy, including liquid fuels and power, electricity, at a commercial and community scale. This is quite a lot to bite off, but we're operating on a real farm out at the University of British Columbia, the UBC farm. It's already a real farm, so we're extending something that's there. It's normally a food farm, and so we're trying to grow some
So
food.
food and energy.
Yeah, we're trying because we
Excellent.
mustn't displace the food, otherwise we will have a monoculture of crops for biodiesel, for instance, and people will quite legitimately be able to say to the enthusiasts of this, yes, but you're either displacing nature by tearing down yet more forests, or you're displacing much needed food production.
This is why
everyone.
we're only trying to do the 10%, not the 90%.
I mean, that's why we're trying to reduce
Yes.
demand by a factor of 10. That's what 90% more or less is, so that you're attempting only to make a fraction of what our current demand is.
Of both the knowledge back.
There's a
and-
there's a very high chance that we can make some reasonable fraction, but it'll only be a fraction. Will it be 10%? We don't know. Might be a bit less, might be a bit more. But if you're aiming to cut your demand so greatly and aiming for a modest but reasonable and sensible amount of production, you've got quite a decent amount of play in there.
It also gets you down to what are those essentials within that 10%, so you
will
can
have to think-
focus on those activities instead of something that is not as essential.
Well, you'll find out what's essential or not.
You'll find out if
Yeah.
you're going to cut
Yeah.
that down.
Yeah.
This has been absolutely fascinating.
Well, you know, if people would like to find out more stuff, our website is www.postcarbon.org, and you can find links to all our initiatives on there.
And I would add, there are a lot of groups that have sprung up that
Yes.
are attempting to localize, calling themselves post-carbon outposts and other names
Yes?
Yeah.
of locality where people are trying to do this. So
We
that
have
people
90, almost 90 in the world now,
Fabulous.
and in 9 different countries.
All right.
So we invite any group that would like to join the Relocalization Network to contact us.
It's called the Relocalization Network, and it's not just for groups that want to form to try what we call these post-carbon experiments of reducing the supply chains, but any group that's pre-existing can also join as an associate of the Relocalization Network.
and be
So we
part
can
of that
share
connection.
information.
So we can share information and knowledge, given that we've not a vast amount of time, in our opinion, before we go into energy decline, and the knowledge we will have to share knowledge in a rather better way than we've previously managed to
Which
do.
is why I think that this is the beginnings of the movement, and we'll come back and call you the mother and father of the relocalization movement. Thank you for being with us. Thank you for joining us on Peak Moment. Join us for next week's episode. Thanks for watching.